We've been taught that women's rights came from the West, from Europe, the Enlightenment, modern feminist movements. But what if I told you that in many African societies, women had power, real power, long before colonization? There was no words like feminism for it. It was just simply equality under nature. The women in Africa owned land, led political councils, divorced freely, and inherited wealth. While in Europe, women were still legally considered extensions of their husbands. This isn't opinion, it's history, and it's time we talk about it. Let's start in Igbo land in what's now Nigeria. Igbo women had their own political institutions, independent of men. They held councils called mikiri, organized protests, and played a direct role in community decisions. They weren't waiting to be included. They were already leading. Just picture that. African women in the 1800s holding councils and organizing protests, while European women were still being denied a voice in public life. Judith Van Allen, in her famous 1972 paper, Sitting on a Man, wrote about the African women stating, "The women's councils were parallel in power to men's." Then came colonialism, and everything changed. The British didn't recognize women's institutions. They only acknowledged male chiefs under their system of indirect rule. Women were pushed out of power structures overnight. When Igbo women resisted this erasure in 1929 during the Aba Women's War, they were met with bullets. Over 50 women were killed by British forces. The message was clear: only men would rule now. These weren't oppressed women being saved. They were leaders being silenced. Now let's talk money. Yoruba women in Nigeria were more than market vendors. They were economic powerhouses. Some became wealthier than their husbands. Yes, richer than their husbands. Historian Bolanle Awe wrote, "A Yoruba woman may become richer than her husband through trade." I know. That might be hard to take in if you grew up thinking wealth, structure, and empowerment only existed in the West. But facts are facts. It might sound unbelievable if you grew up thinking only the West had structure or success. But it happened. It's documented, and it breaks the narrative. In fact, even in similar societies in Ghana, property passed through the mother's line, not the father's. Yes, that was the respect they had for women, and in many villages still do. Women controlled inheritance and family wealth and were seen as more trustworthy. Only recently there have been Western academic studies that have proved women being trustworthy, caring, and giving. But how did they know all of this back then? But Europe didn't. Under coverture laws in Europe, a woman's property automatically became her husband's after marriage. She didn't just share her wealth, she legally ceased to own it. And it wasn't just Nigeria or Ghana. In the heart of West Africa, in Guinea, things were no different. In 1828, French explorer René Caillié traveled through Fouta Djallon. What he saw shocked him. He described Guinea as peaceful, well-governed, full of scholars, and deeply organized. He wrote, "The Fulani govern themselves with wisdom. Their land is rich. The women here are the real merchants of the land. They set the prices, run the markets, and hold great influence over commerce." Women had the right to divorce, inherit property, and get educated. All before many European women could even attend university. Islamic schools in Guinea taught law, medicine, theology, and science, and women were allowed to attend. But after colonization, the French imposed civil law that stripped women of their legal independence. Female chiefs were banned, women lost control of trade, and suddenly economic power belonged to men. Once again, the story was rewritten, but the truth remains. Let's go even further back, to ancient Nubia. Nubians practiced a form of religious openness most of the world hadn't yet imagined. They blended their African beliefs with Egyptian gods like Isis and Amun, and later adopted Christianity, without erasing their native traditions. Historian Derek Welsby notes that Christianity in Nubia didn't replace old beliefs. It merged with them in a distinctly Nubian way. Religious syncretism, tolerance, and inclusion, all before medieval Europe even allowed women to hold real roles in religious life. Before we wrap up, here's one more story you probably didn't hear in school. In the 1st century BCE, there was a one-eyed queen of Nubia named Amanirenas, and she went head-to-head with the Roman Empire. When the Romans tried to expand into Nubia after taking over Egypt, Amanirenas didn't beg or back down. She went to war. Her armies attacked Roman forts, captured soldiers, and even brought back the head of a Roman statue of Emperor Augustus. placing it beneath a temple as a symbol of resistance. But here's the twist. She wasn't just fierce in war. She was respected for her wisdom and fairness too. When a peace treaty was negotiated, the Romans agreed to withdraw and pay no tribute. A rare outcome. Historian Strabo described the Nubians as bold and Amani Reines as a woman of great courage, a strong leader, a fair negotiator, and a queen who stood her ground. Just one more example of the leadership African women held in war and in peace, long before Europe ever imagined them as equals. And these patterns didn't just disappear with colonization. Some African countries are still carrying that legacy of strong women's leadership. Take Senegal. Over 40% of its national parliament is made up of women, one of the highest rates in the world. The country passed a gender parity law in 2010, guaranteeing equal political representation. Senegal also has strong laws against gender-based violence and actively supports women's access to land and business ownership. Now compare that to Hungary, a European Union country. Hungary has one of the lowest rates of female representation in national politics in Europe. It has not ratified the Istanbul Convention on Gender-Based Violence, and it's gone as far as banning gender studies in universities, limiting available freedom of knowledge. Subscribe for more knowledge and you-known stories.